All right, welcome out everybody to the MarketDial webinar here on how to model the impact of COVID-19 on your retail business. We're excited to get underway here. This is being recorded and we'll send it around after. So if you have to jump off for some reason near the end, or you want to circle back and take another look at any concept, there will be a recording out there. We should get it out shortly. I'll go through a quick agenda and talk about the kind of order of operations here, and then we'll kick it off. So after just some brief kind of intro to how to ask questions and all that kind of good stuff, I'll introduce our presenters. They'll take the bulk of the meeting, maybe 30 to 40 minutes, talking through the content. And we'll reserve some dedicated time for Q&A at the end. Ask your questions though throughout. What that will do is I'll be triaging those questions, and if they're pressing and relevant for the slides or the area that we're on right now, I'll ask those questions during the flow. Otherwise, I'll reserve some of these questions for the back part of the discussion. If you look at the bottom of your screen, you should see a little button that says Q&A. Push that button and you can type in a question that comes to me as the host. And then, like I said, I'll kind of batch those together or triage them and ask them to the presenters. You can mark it as anonymous if you would prefer us not to see your name, but your name won't be shared, or your organization or anything won't be shared with any of the other attendees who are on the call. They can't see that part. Likewise, you also don't have the capacity to speak. There's no mic capability on this webinar, and so any communication that you want to send us will need to be done via that Q&A box. My great honor to introduce two of my absolute favorite people for this webinar. The first is Johnny Stoddard. He's the co-founder and chief data scientist here at MarketDial. What that means is he leads our data science team, our client success effort, and also our implementation. Prior to this, he spent several years at McKinsey, as a consulting generalist, and then at the latter part of his time there in the marketing and sales practice area as a specialist analyst there. And he hates that I picked this photo for the webinar, so it brings me all that much more joy to show you a photo of him being a badass, doing a good run there. Also, Gabriel. Gabriel is on our team here as a data scientist. Really excited to have him also join. You'll hear from him most specifically in the back half of this. Gabriel has a master's in math with the specialization in stats and ops research. He, for this in particular, did a lot of the work in the modeling, and you'll see that it's his repo and his content that we're going to be basing this off of. So he'll be here obviously for Q&A and to walk through actually the ins and outs of how to use the model. Other than that, I think we're good to get started. I will turn over control to Johnny and Gabriel, and they can kick it off.
Awesome. Thank you, Morgan. Excited to be here. Thanks everyone for joining. Gabe and I are very excited to walk you through some of this work that we've done related to COVID-19. Just by way of quick summary, what we plan to cover today. So obviously this COVID-19 pandemic, it's led to a lot of changes in the retail sector that we've seen and working with our clients to understand, and has led to a lot of uncertainty. So to that end, we've created a free resource. It's battle tested, and we've worked through it with our clients around scenario planning to understand some of the impacts of COVID-19. And our main goal here is to share some of our thoughts, but introduce you to the model most especially, and ensure you know how to use it, give you a chance to ask any questions. All right. So let's talk just a little bit about the situation as we know it before we dive into the model. Yep.
Yep. Just a programming note, Johnny. We're looking at your desktop background and not the deck.
Sorry. How are we doing now?
Beautiful.
All right, thank you. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the situation at hand here. So obviously the COVID-19 pandemic is a human tragedy, but there's a lot of unknowns at this point. So obviously the virus is novel. We know from the news that there's a lot of asymptomatic cases. Testing's a challenge. Supply chains are strained. Hospital capacity is becoming more and more of an issue. And there's been a lot of different approaches folks have taken to kind of curb the effects of this. And really it's led to a lot of variance in understanding just the human impact here before we even talk about the economics. So, the folks at 538 have looked at just different experts and what they see this pandemic leading to, and there's a lot of variance in that. And what that can really lead to here is just differences in what the economic impact could be. So there's several things that drive this, and some of these are showing some positive trends right now. So, social distancing is becoming a term that everyone's familiar with, and it's helping slow the growth of this pandemic. Testing capacity is trying to rise to reach demand. There's expectation that in the southern hemisphere we won't see as much of an uptick. It could be that new cases rise just till April. Public sentiment becomes more confident as we start to see some of these wins. And where this can lead us, is there's some folks who've done some smart thinking on this, like McKinsey and the Oxford economics folks have looked at different scenarios that, if these things break our way, we could see some early recoveries, and things could bounce back as early as end of Q3 into Q4 of this year. Of course, there's a lot of unknowns and things that could break slightly different. So, some of the drivers could be that the pandemic peaks a little bit later, demand really lags, the layoffs and bankruptcies really lead to kind of a downward spiral. And recovery might not come until later when things like immunity, so herd immunity, vaccines become available, which can be a longer time horizon. And that can lead to slower recovery in that case. So we could be looking years out to really returning to this upcoming recession pre levels. And that could extend as far as 2023. So a lot of unknowns. And then when you start to think a bit more micro about this, the impacts are also just very disparate in how they fall to different industries and specifically different verticals within retail. So each retailer has its own challenges. We're seeing some things like small rises. So Walmart and Domino's with a lot of hiring. Other retailers like Lowe's just struggling to keep up with appliance sales. Other retailers are struggling to keep up. So in the design fashion space, a lot of big changes and layoffs. In the restaurant space, there's been obviously a big change in how the dining experience works. And even within certain verticals, you're seeing disparate changes as well. And this is also very much a geographic story. So some of our friends at Womply have been doing a lot of tracking of what the geographic effects are for retail. And you can see interesting trends about grocery sales spiking at different times and in different ways across the states, as well as restaurant sales and how those are slumping across the board, but very strong in the Midwest and elsewhere. So there's a lot of unknowns. Impacts will be felt uneven, and they'll be felt differently by different retailers. So with that as a backdrop, we've helped retailers with this. We've basically created some tools to help understand these impacts and how they'll affect their specific business. And really our approach has been around measuring this impact and building scenarios to understand the variance of potential outcomes. And what that looks like is we've created tools to do volume projections using machine learning, and a spreadsheet, to do different scenarios and measure overall impact to the business. And so what I'm going to talk through is this volume projection model. It's a Python-based model, and what that is, what it's doing, and how to leverage it. And then also the scenario planning spreadsheet, which is really the tool where you can take some of these projections and look at what different effects could mean for your business. So let's talk about this volume projection model. I think it's helpful to actually just start by talking about what volume projection means in predictive modeling in general. The main idea behind it is to take data. So in this instance, this is sales for an example category for a specific store. A lot of retail data has seasonality to it, obviously, as consumer behaviors follow a pretty predictable pattern over the year and in different seasons. This data provides a raw signal to a predictive algorithm. And what you can do is take that data, you can build a model, which in effect leverages different rules to understand that past behavior and build predictions on how that behavior would look going forward. And a common thing that you do when you leverage this model is you predict it against something known, like the latest year of data in this instance. So we're taking everything we can learn from 2016 to 18, building a model to project 2019, fine-tuning it to get the lowest kind of error in that prediction. And then that model, those rules and the parameters we fine-tune, you use to predict the unknown. And in that case, that's 2020. And really our approach here is to leverage this past data to build a projection of a base case. So if there were no COVID-19 pandemic, what would we expect sales to be? And that becomes a helpful baseline to measure deviations in the actual world, so what the impact is, and then also deviations relative to different scenarios, slow recovery, fast recovery, et cetera. And so we basically leveraged a couple different models in the Python that you'll see in our GitHub. We basically explored a bunch of different approaches. I'll touch on very high level, and I'll spend some depth talking about the model we found to work really well. The first two models, very similar, signal trend decomposition, one with least squares regression, another with an ARIMA model. Both of these, what they're doing is decomposing that signal into a seasonal trend as well, to the seasonal trend, the overall trend. So think of that like the comps or things going up or down for stores. And then in the least squares regression, pulling out this residual component. They're both very good at handling seasonal data. The main difference, as you'll see on this, I'll walk through this a bit more. The ARIMA model is very fine-tuned to time series data. It's a very complex model. It requires a lot of tuning to make it work, but can be very powerful. A very simple method that we found works really well is computing average comps for a prior 20 weeks and applying a pretty simple rule to project next week's data and on to make a full projection. We found that this simple model actually performed really well. All three of these are available in the GitHub repo. So just to dive in a little bit more, the first two models, what they're essentially doing is taking this raw signal of prior data. In the least squares side of things, it's decomposing signal into a trend, seasonality, and residual, which is kind of the leftover noise, fitting a regression line, extending that seasonality, and combining all of this information into a projection. ARIMA does a similar thing. It uses a very sophisticated model here. ARIMA stands for autoregressive integrated moving average. So it's using very nuanced moving averages to understand both the trend as well as residual, and leads to a different projection. Obviously, they're normally very similar to each other, but some can have different error rates. A model that we found works surprisingly well is this simple lag yearly comp method. I think it's pretty easy to understand. What it essentially does is to predict a data point, like this data point here. What we're going to do is we're going to look at the prior, in this case, 10 weeks, and we're going to compare that to a comp week last year. And we're going to basically look at the comp, the difference here. So in this case, it's sales. We see that on average for those 10 weeks, there's about a $620 difference, very small as a percentage of this category. And then what we're going to do to project this data point is we're going to look at the comp week, the last year data point, and combine both of these information. So we're going to take the comp number, we're going to add in this difference to get a projection. So very simple model. Actually, this is a lot of what ARIMA is doing, but on a very iterative basis. But we found that this simple rule worked really well in projecting sales or other volume categories, be it traffic, et cetera.
Johnny, we got a question that might make sense here. Does this relate the same? It looks like a lot of this is based on sales. Does this relate the same if we're thinking about something like traffic or any number of other kind of metrics or KPIs you might be looking at?
Yeah, great question. Great question. It definitely applies across the board for different time series metrics. So be that traffic, units sold, revenue. It works very well across the board. The model itself predicts each of those variables independent of one another. The thing that you may find, and this is why we provided this in the GitHub, is certain models may do better for different metrics. Overall, we found that this simple lagged model works well across most every metric, but it works well kind of across the board. Awesome. So yeah, obviously, once we train the model, as I had described before, it's going to be projected against a known quantity, in this case, 2020 sales. Error rates are then computed to kind of fine tune the model. We've seen different error rates across different categories, retail verticals, as low as 1 to 2%, as high as 50%. This becomes a helpful way to think through at what level to do the modeling. So obviously, product level is a bit too granular. We found that category department levels, you can get pretty good projections. And then from there,
Johnny, is there, sorry to interrupt, is there a like benchmark or something that we'd be targeting? Obviously lower is better, but is there a zone in which we'd start to feel comfortable on those error rates?
Yeah, typically what we've seen is anywhere within the 20 to 30% can be okay. We've certainly seen for some verticals, it's really hard to get error rates as low as, say, 1 to 5%, which is the most ideal. I think you can get a pretty good model in the, call it 20% range, but typically anywhere, from 1 to 5% is amazing. Anywhere from like 5 to 20% is pretty workable.
Great, thanks.
Awesome. Yeah, and so with that model, obviously, and again, this is what the tool's doing, is it's going to help project 2020 sales. It can be used to do beyond, but obviously it gets a little bit fuzzier as you get further out. But what this does is it creates a good baseline to think about two things. One is loss realized. We also call this, actual impact. And what that is as we start to look at how sales may decline or increase by certain categories, you can look at the projected versus the actual and start to look at, well, what are we seeing in terms of COVID-19? And that can provide some empirical data to understand the impact in real time. The other thing that provides some value is looking at the projected versus different scenarios that you can build, low or high scenarios across different categories and over time. And this can help quantify, especially going forward into 2020 and beyond, what to expect in terms of impact. So let's talk a little bit about this scenario planning, which I've set up a little bit. So we've created a spreadsheet that helps with this at a very high level. The spreadsheet takes the outputs from the Python projections in CSV format. There's a place to paste them into an Excel spreadsheet, and then do various scenario planning, which I'll talk about in more detail. But at a very high level, we think of scenario planning as, well, what's the volume or the metric of interest in terms of volume we're projecting? And so this goes back to a prior question. Sales, units, profitability, traffic are key things that our clients have looked at. So you'll select a metric of interest. You'll input different assumptions about decreases or increases in volume by category and by week, as well as regional effects, so decreases and increases above and beyond in certain regions. And the spreadsheet takes that information and does some of that computation of actual and then projected or scenario impact. Obviously, this can help drive a lot of different business decisions, so forecasting and just understanding the different budgetary implications. Tracking ongoing impact, understanding which categories may be more lost causes versus ones to promote, seeing if region-specific impacts are going to be big drivers. Basic kind of sensitivity analysis is where this can be really helpful. So the spreadsheet itself, so I'll walk through this at a pretty high level and show like how this can be helpful. But basically, Excel spreadsheet where there are some tabs we've colored blue, orange, and green. The blue tabs are basically the input tabs. So there's going to be a couple sections to paste information that's going to come from the Python projections. That's going to be the actuals and the projections, typically on a category store week basis is how that output will come out. And then everything else kind of updates based on that. There's a couple orange tabs where you're going to change different scenarios. So the metric of interest, the category impacts, the region impacts. And then what that flows through to is these green tabs. And it's really a lot of ways to look at kind of some interesting information. I really like this chart impact tab because I'm a visual learner. And so what you'll basically be able to see is what the trends are from an impact and overall volume basis for the actuals, the projected, as well as the scenario of interest, whether you believe a category is going to go up or down and to what level. And all of that is basically fed by these other calculations that are happening. So the actuals, the scenario of interest based on your inputs, the projection, meaning what the Python model is saying is a base case, and then the subtraction of these. So the actual impact, which would be obviously the actuals versus the baseline projection, and the scenario impact, which is your scenario minus the baseline projection. And so roughly what this looks like and how it works is, and I'm pulling some stuff directly from the spreadsheet here, but let's tie this back to some of our earlier discussion. There's different scenarios at a very broad level, which is, you know, kind of a quick bounce back economic recovery that would translate to your business versus a more prolonged slow recovery. And, you know, I created an example here in the spreadsheet of some categories where we would expect some increases and one where we may expect decreases. And so the way to potentially think of that is things like, you know, this orange potentially being something like prepared foods, where we may just stop selling it due to health reasons. Whereas the lighter orange up here may be something like toilet paper or canned goods, where we may see a big spike. Kind of a heartwarming one that we've seen across our clients is liquor sales are going up. That's not expected to plateau at this higher level, but we're seeing a lot of increases for that. So, and then other categories that may be hit not as deeply. And as you kind of input these category impacts across time, that feeds into looking at a scenario of impact relative to the projection. And then the spreadsheet will quantify, well, what is the area under the curve here between this projection and scenario? As well as, you know, for, you know, like a prolonged where we maybe not see anything happen here until Q4. So
one good question here is, it's kind of twofold. On the Excel, you know, we're doing, every week we learn more about how this unfolds. Does it make sense to come back and update your projections or your kind of scenarios in the Excel on a regular basis, or do we kind of set it or forget it, or how should we think about that?
It's a really good question, and 100%. Some of the best data to feed into your scenarios is empirically, what are you seeing in your business? So the answer to that is yes. And it's pretty easy to use the tool to update those actuals and then update the scenarios based on it. But yeah, one of the best indicators of what things are going to look like going forward is the most recent data. Obviously, there's still a bunch of unknowns, but a good thing to feed in.
A kind of follow-up question is, does it make sense to update the Python, you know, output projections as well as data goes on, or should we, you know, just assume that, like, do it as of a certain date, maybe the end of February or something?
Yeah, it's a really
and
good
then
question.
let that one ride.
It's a really good question. It's a bit of a nuanced answer. So definitely the thing that you'll want to update as you get more information and learning about impacts on your business is your actuals and your scenario planning. On the projection side of things, key to having a good baseline is actually building projections before we see COVID-19 impacts. So I'm pointing here because you can see in this case here, you're seeing big drops in overall sales. You actually don't want to feed that data into a baseline projection, because the baseline should be a way of thinking about the non-COVID effect here. So typically, you aren't going to want to update those projections. There's a different exercise that you could do of, well, based on this you know, recent data, can we project the COVID-19 impact? The thing that we found is we are so early in this that those models can be very hard to be, or are not super valuable, because we've only got a few weeks of information. But you're only going to want to update the projections, or you're not going to want to update the projections going forward. You're going to want to do the projections based on a time before COVID-19 really affected your business.
Great. Awesome. Thanks.
Great. Cool. So So we've created a GitHub for you. I'm going to actually let Gabe walk through this a little bit from here to just give you kind of a sense of what's there.
Great, thanks, Johnny. Let me go ahead and share my screen here and walk through our GitHub repository.
This there was a question actually that came up, Gabe, while you're pulling this up, which is what do you do if you don't know Python? And I could probably just go ahead and answer this while Gabe preps it. And there's probably two answers. First is if there's somebody that sits around you or somebody in the business that does know Python, that's maybe the great place to start. Otherwise, we're very happy to help out and lend a hand. Reach out to us. You can email, you know, Johnny or myself, or we have an email that kind of triages this kind of stuff. It's covid@marketdial.com, and we can, at the very least, just point you in the right direction. All of this work, obviously, we're putting out there for free, and the tools for free, and we're happy to do the same and point you in the right direction for free as well. So if this stuff that Gabe's going to go through is over your head like it's over my head, don't be too nervous. Reach out. We're happy to help get you the projections, and then you can do the scenario modeling and stuff in the related Excel.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you, Morgan. Of course, we're happy to help. And ideally, we've written it in a way that you should only need to change a few lines of text. I realize if you're unfamiliar with Python, that still can seem daunting. So we're happy to help you do that. So let me go ahead and just start with the forecast methods. This is kind of an uncalled script that sits in the background that kind of contains all of like the math we do for the projections. And so like Johnny mentioned, we've tried 3 different methodologies and they're all contained here in the Python code. The one that we set as default and that we recommend is our simple lagged comp one. The reason being is that these other 2, the least squares regression and the ARIMA, have parameters that we've kind of set defaults for, but generally you want to define like the weighting of your data points or the structure of your ARIMA model or its degree of complexity based on the structure of your data. And there's just no way we can do that pre-hand. So we've set some like decent defaults, but in general, if you're using one of these more sophisticated methods, you want to tune it. And so we recommend sticking with this simple forecast lag comp method. And so to get the projections, essentially all of the code here needs one thing, which is a sample or an input data file. And so we have a sample here of what that input data file should look like. Let me just pull this up. Essentially what it is there's 5 columns: the hierarchy, the store ID, the date day, what metric you're looking at, and then the value for that metric on that day given the department and store. And you just have, if you have a CSV containing this data kind of in this tabular form, then the code will read all this in, parse it, format it, and do everything that it needs to make the forecasts. So if you can get
Gabe,
your
are you feeding, you know, you do this once for revenue and then you do it again for traffic, or would you put just the new metric name and value of, you know, revenue could be one line and traffic could be a different line, et cetera?
Good question. Yeah, you can just stack those on top of each other. So it can all be in one file. You can have any number of departments, any number of stores. If you don't have departments, you can just add a column and call it total store. And it will iterate through all departments, all stores, all metrics that it sees in the file and create projections for the year for all 3 of those. So once you have that sample or that input data, the few things that you'll need to change is you'll go into this run forecast script, and there's just these beginning parameters that you need to set. It's the year that you want to make projections for. In this case, we recommend starting with 2019 so you can see how well it worked on your data. And then you input the week start. This is the week you want to start making the projections for. So if you put in week 10, it will use the first 9 weeks of 2019 as part of the training data. And then it will project for the remaining 43 weeks. And then you'll specify.
Just a question in there too, and this is related to some questions that folks have asked. Have we seen any particular day that makes sense to kind of start as the projections, or does that vary by retailer or, you know, brand, et cetera?
Most of our clients have been US, so we haven't seen much variance in this. We've kind of cut it off at the first 9 weeks, or beginning March is where we say that the COVID response started happening. I'm sure if you're in other countries, you could see responses much earlier than that. But for the most part, we've seen March as a good cutoff point.
Great, thanks.
Great. So you'll specify which of the 3 methods you want. Again, you won't have to do anything with these methodologies. We've already input parameters to them. You just change the text here of what methodology you want to use. You can try different ones and see which method works best for your data. And then you'll specify what the input file name is. So that's the file containing all of your data. And then you'll just execute that script, and it will save these output files with your projected revenue, or whatever metrics you want to include. So this could be revenue, units, profit, traffic, and it will output all of these into a week by week projection. So you'll have the hierarchy, store ID, year, what week number, the metric, and then the projected value. And then we've included 2 scripts to kind of help you evaluate that. So it will essentially output all of the projections into these files so that you can use it for any more kind of advanced analytics that you wanted to do. We've also included 2 scripts that should help you kind of gauge how well this worked on your data. One of them is the evaluate model errors script. This will read in the projected and the real data. It will look week by week across stores, and then it will tell you what the kind of % errors on those are. And then also, if you want a visual comparison of how well it worked, you can run this plot all forecasts. And this will loop through every hierarchy and then plot your real versus projected. And so it will give you some figures like this, where you'll see kind of the real revenue versus your projected, and you can visually gauge how well that projection worked on your individual data.
Hey, Gabe, we got a question here. You've mentioned a few times this will loop by hierarchy. There's a question here. Can you define what we mean when we say the word hierarchy?
Okay, yeah. So hierarchy is just any grouping of products, or any grouping of products within your store. And so we could call it hierarchy or department, or if you don't have it at that granular level, you can just call it total, and it would be all revenue and traffic for the store.
Yeah,
Great,
so
thanks.
examples like this could be, in a grocery setting, produce and meat, and, in a restaurant setting, entrees versus drinks, et cetera. It's really tailored to the business in terms of how you think about categorizing products, typically in a hierarchical structure, but the model's pretty flexible to whatever way you categorize products.
Yep. Great. And then we've also included, as Johnny walked through the Excel file, we have kind of a description of how you should use it and how to paste in the data. But once you have those outputs from the projection, you can use the sample CSV that we have here, or sample Excel file, and just paste the outputted projections into that. And then you'll kind of have that scenario modeling tool that Johnny walked through in your hands.
Gabe and Johnny, a good question I should just rolled in here. And I'll just kind of read through it. It says, hey, can you analyze trends and impact at a more granular geographical level, like state, MSA, or even something smaller like county or zip?
Yeah, absolutely. The generalized model that we've put out there on GitHub, there's not like a tab built for this right now. We could certainly work with you to build it pretty easily. But the good news is that the modeling is at as granular a level as a store. So certainly, and we've worked with some of our clients on building that out. It's actually pretty easy to build that out, like within the Excel, but obviously happy to help with that.
Yeah, so basically, since you have each individual store, you could go and append a region or an MSA or a state, basically, and then cut and slice by that. Is that?
Yeah,
is that
exactly. Yeah, some of the customization we've done is just like drop downs to look at, okay, what's the impact by region X, DMA X, or even store X, Y, or Z. So.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's kind of the underlying philosophy, is we do it at a very granular level, and then you can roll it up to whatever level works for your analysis. And so that's kind of the main overview of the GitHub and how to use the code. Obviously, like Morgan said, we're more than happy. Our emails will be provided. If you want to reach out to us, we can certainly take some time to help you run through the code and get it up and running with your data.
Perfect. We'll go back to my screen. I know we've got some great questions coming through. I think I'm sharing the wrong screen again. One sec. Okay, perfect. Yeah, so obviously the repo is there, free to use, but please do reach out with any questions. We tried to be very general with what we put out there, knowing that there's a lot of different use cases you may throw at this. We think it's pretty intuitive, but please reach out with any questions, requests for assistance. We're happy to help run forecasting models for you. Think through error rates, what levels to kind of do this at, tweaks to the Excel model, how to think about scenario planning. Reach out to us. Probably best is direct to myself or Gabriel, but we're happy to help.
Great. Thanks.
So yeah,
we've got some questions here, and I think they keep filtering in. So I'll go ahead and ask a few of these. There's a handful of questions that are around how to think about different types of retailers, and maybe in a couple different categories here, where first is maybe traditional only retail, that's only kind of brick and mortar.
Sure.
Then there's some group that have an online presence, and how would we think about kind of merging in some of that online data? And then, and I don't know that we've done a ton of thinking on this because most of our clients are brick and mortar, but do we have any thoughts on how we might adapt this for digitally native or only online type of businesses?
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I think there's like an underlying question that everyone has on what are the effects to online traffic and sales, and how does retail change? So yeah, it's very dependent on each business, but there are certainly ways that you can leverage this model to understand some of that stuff. And the fundamentals are still the same. Online is typically, or it can be a part of a retailer's overall sales. It's just a different channel. And so you could certainly do projections based on that, understand a baseline, do scenario planning, typically, an uptick in this case on, how would online sales change? So it's a very similar way that you could leverage the model very easily. You could just call online a different channel. You could call it a different category and do those projections based on it. As far as looking forward and what this could look like, there's a lot of different ways to think about it. So we obviously would anticipate volume increasing for online, but it could hit different places differently. Some business models don't translate super well into online. We're learning different things about how fulfillment works online. So in the restaurant space, there's this kind of new concept of a contactless delivery, where you can order online, go to the restaurant location, something's placed on the ground and you pick it up. So how those things are going to affect retail going forward can be challenging to understand, but you could certainly leverage a tool like this to plan different scenarios, measure kind of overall impact, and use those empirics to feed scenario planning going forward. I know there are a few questions in there. Was there anything I missed, Morgan?
Nope. I think that's a good kind of overview. And to the folks listening in, feel free to ask more if you want to double click on any of this. So there's a couple questions actually that I'm trying to kind of batch together, and it's basically, for an example of one of these questions is at the beginning of the webinar, we talked about different scenarios of a recovery in Q3 or Q4 or potentially longer. And before the webinar, we received some questions around like, well, how will this affect long-term customer behavior? And I guess the question is, do we know anything special or unique about that at this point, Johnny? Or what should we say about how we could think about building these scenarios?
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah, and this is kind of the $1 million question about, well, what are the scenarios that we should think through? I would point to, we're good friends with the folks at McKinsey, and I think they've done really good thinking on this. So their briefing materials on COVID-19, we found is a helpful way to just get our arms wrapped around the problem. They've done great work with, the Oxford Economics on doing forecasting and understanding at a very macro level how things are going to change across the world. A lot of that's dependent on, things that we'll see in China and different countries and how they respond to this and consumer sentiment and how things change there. I would say, in general, how we've helped our retailers get their heads wrapped around scenario planning is thinking first about, well, what are the category and region effects that you are seeing currently? how do you anticipate those things going forward? And what is a best case and worst case scenario that you can envision? And let's build those as kind of a high-low to look at and understand the sensitivity of kind of tweaking those parameters. So, literally that's, using the Excel to build, a really worst case versus a best case, understanding kind of the delta between those two, and then kind of building out from there. So looking at, okay, what are the effects on XYZ category if we relax these assumptions in different ways? I think the empirics that you're going to see here over the next, call it these prior 3-4 weeks, where in the US and Canada, we've seen a lot of these effects, that's really valuable information. It's not a lot of data points, but it's really valuable information to think about those scenarios. What kind of declines have we seen there? And I think tracking that going forward will obviously be a helpful way to think about scenario planning.
Perfect, thanks. One more question is kind of bringing it maybe more to life even. So a question came in basically, how would we use this model, both the Python and the accompanying Excel, to do something like make a staffing decision? Really just super practical there.
Yeah. I think where this could become valuable, and let me see if I can actually share. Did this come through, Morgan? Can you see a spreadsheet here?
Yep, looks good.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, so the way to kind of think through this, I saw that question come through and was thinking about it. So basically, the way I would think through it is this is where the metric of traffic can be very valuable. In this example, I don't have traffic built in, but looking at traffic and how that is changing over time is a good way to think about staffing, because typically, in an ideal world, you're staffing to how many people are in your store to drive conversion, et cetera. And so one way that you can think about this is, well, let's look at different categories. What are the empirical changes that we're seeing in those categories? You can look at the actual effects. You can see what that impact looks like in a numeric or percentage basis. And then you can use that to start to plan and say, okay, what do we think is going to happen in different categories and build different curves for them? And then what categories really drive my staffing? So in a grocery context, obviously your prepared foods, produce, meat tend to be more staffing heavy, where it's helpful to have an associate there who's can speak to the product, whereas center store, front of store might not have as much staffing there. And understanding and looking at those scenarios, looking at kind of the overall impact, but looking at that as a way to say, okay, if I am expecting a traffic decrease of about 30%, if I were to keep, say, my volume per labor hour the same, what would that mean in terms of how many people to have in my store? So as I look at this trend and I look at the volumes, and let's say in this case it was not for revenue but traffic, a good place to start is to say, okay, if I look at my pre-levels of traffic per someone walking in the store, my labor headcount per traffic, what does that look like before COVID? And if I were to keep that the same, what would that look like? And then to basically play with it from there. So I think just looking at the projections for traffic is a great place to start. Think about category effects and how those categories drive different staffing levels, and to look at pre-traffic levels to understand kind of that ratio and understand what potential effects might be.
Perfect, thanks. The only thing I might add that could be helpful as well as you're thinking about this is, our friends at Retail Next talk a lot about the kind of customer to associate ratio. And as you're watching over time, the customers, declining, or at least for this, in this interim time, as they're quite a bit lower, then, and you can kind of get some projections on where you're trending versus actual, then you can appropriately try to pull down your associate to keep that ratio roughly the same, if that's an important, kind of measure of profitability for that business as well. So. Great, we have maybe one more question here, and it's less particularly about the model, Johnny, and maybe more just what we've seen with our clients or how we would think about this. And it's, is there a particular type of retailer that we think has better odds of surviving, or put a different way, are there types of retail that we've seen that are thriving or that you know, might be able to weather this rockier storm coming up and come out healthy on the other side.
Yeah.
Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, definitely. Happy to share some thoughts. It's certainly something that's kind of $1 million question where we're all trying to struggle to understand that. But certainly some things that we've seen, obviously retailers that have an already built-in online presence are benefiting, or they're weathering the storm better than others, because there's just had to be rapid change in how it is that you're fulfilling what it is that you sell to clients. And so when you already have, you know, a channel distribution around online or purchase in store, that's certainly going to help retailers there. I'd say in general, what we're finding is retailers that are just more culturally dynamic and innovative are able to weather this a bit better than others. And then there's also just certain headwinds for certain types of retailers. So, you know, we've seen on the grocery and convenience side of things that, you know, it's not that things are just going to be rosy there. There's certainly been some need to be dynamic and think about supply chain, but they're obviously benefiting from this well, whereas in design and fashion and restaurant, it's been really big and challenging changes. I'd say we've seen larger retailers do well because they have the personnel and the thinking, and they're dynamic enough to be able to change. Whereas smaller retailers might just not have those capabilities in-house. So it's hard to say, but I think, you know, some of the folks that have the underlying fundamentals, the ability to be dynamic and change on the fly, having online and other technologies in place certainly will benefit those retailers.
Great. Thanks, Johnny. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and we can kind of wrap up here. Appreciate Johnny and Gabriel, you two taking the time to do all this crazy amount of work to get this out and going. I know it's been really taxing on the both of you to get this model there, and it's constantly changing and updating. And thanks everybody for joining and participating with your questions. Again, we're going to post the recording of this. We'll kind of cut out the beginning and end to make it a little bit more succinct. That will be both on our website and YouTube, and then we'll also email out a link to everybody that's signed up for this, so you'll have access to this. Finally, reach out if there's any way that we can help you. If you just need, hey, how the heck do I get this Python script to run and get me the data that I need for the forecasting model, or if you want to make changes or updates to the Python or to the forecast or to the scenario model, we'd love it and appreciate it. We're all in this together and trying to figure it out. And so any change and support and iterations, the better. So thanks again, everybody, and we'll talk soon.